Chapter 8. Mystery of a Photograph. They stared at each other. "It couldn't be anyone else," said Bobby. "He was the only person who could have taken one photograph away and put another in its place." "What was this Bassington Ffrench like, Bobby?" Bobby frowned in the effort of remembering. "Very ordinary, pleasant voice, a gentleman. I really didn't notice him particularly. He said something about looking for a house." "We can check that," said Frankie. "Wheeler and Owen are the only house agents." Suddenly she shivered. "Bobby, if Pritchard was pushed over the cliff, Bassington Ffrench must be the man who pushed him. Everything fits. Your unexpected appearance spoilt the murderer's plans. Your discovery of the photograph and, as a result, the need to get rid of you." "There's a problem there," said Bobby. "Let's say that the photograph was so important I had to be got out of the way. Then it would have to be done at once. The fact that I went to London and never saw the photograph in the Marchbolt Weekly Times was pure chance. Otherwise, I would have immediately said, 'That isn't the photograph I saw.' Why wait till after the inquest, when everything was nicely settled and no one had any idea that Pritchard had been murdered?" "It must have been something else," admitted Frankie. "Something they didn't know about till after the inquest. Bobby, what was it Pritchard said just before he died?" "Why didn't they ask Evans?" "Suppose that was it. Bobby, I'm sure it's that. Oh no, I'm being an idiot. You never told the Caymans about it." "I did," said Bobby slowly. "I wrote to them that evening." "And 2 days later, you got this letter asking you to go to South America?" "Yes." "Well," said Frankie, "you turn it down, and the next thing they poured morphia into your bottle of beer." "According to our present theory," Bobby said thoughtfully, "it goes like this. Dead man X, because we don't know that his name really is Pritchard, is pushed over the cliff. It is important that X should not be identified. So, a portrait of Mrs. C is put in his pocket, and the portrait of the beautiful girl removed. Who was she, I wonder?" "Keep to the point," said Frankie, irritated. "Mrs. C waits for the photograph to appear, and then, pretending to be the very sad sister, identifies X as her brother, who has just returned from abroad," said Bobby. "You don't believe he could really have been her brother?" "Not for a moment. You know, it puzzled me all along. The Caymans were a different class altogether. The dead man was, well, it sounds a most awful thing to say, and so old-fashioned, but the dead man was definitely from the upper classes." "And the Caymans most emphatically weren't?" "Most emphatically." "And then, just when everything has gone well from the Caymans' point of view, you mess things up," said Frankie. "Why didn't they ask Evans?" Bobby repeated. "I can't see what on earth there can be in that to make anyone anxious." "Well, the question must have meant something really important to them, and they couldn't have realized it meant nothing to you. But they weren't going to take a chance. You were safer out of the way." "They took a lot of risk. Why didn't they plan another accident?" No, that would have been stupid. 2 accidents within a week of each other? It might have suggested a connection between the two, and then people would have begun another investigation of the first one." "And yet you said that morphia wasn't easy to get." "It isn't. You have to sign poison books and things." "Oh, of course, that's a clue. Whoever did it had easy access to supplies of morphia." "A doctor, a hospital nurse, or a chemist?" suggested Bobby. Well, I was thinking more of illegally imported drugs. You can't mix up too many different sorts of crime, said Bobby. But the strong point would be the absence of motive, said Frankie. Your death doesn't benefit anyone. So what will the police think? A madman, said Bobby. And that's what the police actually do think. You see, it's very simple, really. Bobby began to laugh suddenly. What's amusing you? Just the thought of how sickening it must be for them. All that morphia, enough to kill 16 people, and here I am, still alive and well. But the question is, what do we do next? Oh, lots of things, said Frankie immediately. Such as? We find out about Bassington Ffrench's house hunting, said Frankie, if he even did any. He will have. Think for a minute. Bassington Ffrench must be above suspicion. Not only must there be nothing to connect him with the dead man, there must be no suggestion of a mysterious stranger seen in the neighbourhood of the accident. Yes, said Frankie thoughtfully. Now, if we knew who the dead man really was, it was certainly important that he shouldn't be recognised, which was why there was all the pretence of Mrs. Cayman being his sister, Bobby said. After that, even if there had been pictures of him in the papers, people would only say, "Isn't it strange, this man Pritchard, who fell over a cliff, is really incredibly like Mr. X." And he couldn't have been a family man whose wife or relations would go to the police at once and report him missing, said Frankie wisely. Perhaps he had just come back from abroad, Frankie. He was marvellously suntanned, like a big game hunter. Why didn't they ask Evans? Frankie said. The dead man must have come down here to see Evans. Now, if we could find Evans... How many Evanses, Bobby interrupted, do you think there are in Marchbolt? 700, I should think, admitted Frankie. At least. So, it's Bassington Ffrench we must investigate, Frankie decided. There we have got something solid to go on. It's an uncommon name. I'll ask Father. He knows the names of most of the aristocratic families and where they live. Yes, Bobby said. That's a good idea. Then we might do something. We are going to do something, aren't we? Of course we are. Do you think I'm going to be given 8 grains of morphia and do nothing about it? That's the spirit, said Frankie. And besides that, said Bobby, there's the unpleasant experience of having the morphia pumped out of my stomach. That's enough, said Frankie. You'll be giving me all the horrible details again if I don't stop you. And I thought women were supposed to be the sympathetic sex, said Bobby. Chapter 9. Concerning Mr. Bassington Ffrench. Father, Frankie said that evening, do you know any Bassington Ffrenches? What about them? Said Lord Marchington. Frankie didn't know anything about them. She made a statement, knowing that her father enjoyed disagreement. They're a Yorkshire family, aren't they? Nonsense. They're from Hampshire. There's the Shropshire ones, of course, and the Irish lot. Which are your friends? I'm not sure, said Frankie. People move around so much nowadays. Are they well off? I couldn't say. The Shropshire lot have lost a lot of their money, I believe. One of the Hampshire ones married an heiress, an American woman. On the following day, Frankie walked into the office of Wheeler and Owen, house and estate agents. Mr. Owen himself jumped up to receive her. Frankie gave him a surprisingly friendly smile and dropped into a chair. And what can we have the pleasure of doing for you, Lady Frances? I believe a friend of mine was down here the other day, a Mr. Bassington Ffrench. Ah, yes, indeed. He was making inquiries about small properties,
because he would like to buy a house here, but he had to return to town the next day. I have sent him the information on 1 or 2.
Did you write to London or to the country address? Inquired Frankie.
Frank, he called to a young clerk, Mr. Bassington Ffrench's address. Meroway Court, Staveley, Hampshire, said the clerk.
Ah, said Frankie, then it wasn't my Mr. Bassington Ffrench. This must be his cousin. I thought it was odd his being here and not contacting me. Frankie left the office in a thoughtful mood. Mr. Bassington Ffrench seemed clear and honest. But no, she decided, Bassington Ffrench was the guilty person, and began to make plans. Chapter 10. Preparations for an Accident. A week later, Bobby had joined Badger in London. Frankie wrote that she had a plan, and he was to do nothing until he heard from her. This was welcome advice, since Bobby was kept busy undoing the mess that Badger had already made of the business. Meanwhile, the effect of being given 8 grains of morphia was making Bobby extremely suspicious of food and drink, and had also persuaded him to bring to London a gun, which he'd got in the Navy. He was just beginning to feel that the whole thing had simply been a nightmare when Frankie's Bentley finally stopped outside the garage. Frankie was driving, and beside her sat a rather gloomy-looking young man. "Hello, Bobby," said Frankie. "This is George Arbuthnot. He's a doctor, and we shall need him."
"Aren't you being a bit pessimistic?" Bobby asked.
"Look here," said Frankie. "I've got everything planned. We want a car to crash, and one of yours will do."
"She means," George Arbuthnot said, "that she's going to have an accident." "How does she know?" said Bobby wildly.
Frankie gave an annoyed sigh. "Now just listen, Bobby. Bassington Ffrench lives at Meroway Court at Staveley in Hampshire, which belongs to his brother, with his brother and his wife."
"Whose wife?"
"The brother's wife. I've made a plan. Lady Frances Derwent, driving her car dangerously, crashes into the wall near the gates of Meroway Court. Lady Frances is carried to the house, suffering from concussion and shock, and must not be moved for 2 or 3 days.
"Who says so?"
"George. George is passing, sees the accident, jumps out of his car, makes his examination, says what's wrong with her, and goes away."
"And where do I come in?" Bobby asked.
"You don't. My dear child, Bassington Ffrench has met you already, but he doesn't know me. But I am a lady, and therefore highly respectable. And George is a real doctor, so everything is quite above suspicion."
"And I don't do anything at all?" asked Bobby. He felt like a dog whose bone has been taken away.
"Of course you do, darling. You grow a moustache."
"Oh, do I? Once I've got the moustache, what do I do?"
"Put on a chauffeur's uniform and drive the Bentley down to Staveley."
Bobby looked more cheerful.
"Nobody looks at a chauffeur in the way they look at a person," said Frankie. "I'd bet anything that seeing you in a chauffeur's uniform with a moustache, Bassington Ffrench wouldn't recognize you. Now tell me, what do you think of the plan?"
"It's pretty good," Bobby said generously.
"In that case," said Frankie briskly, "let's buy a car." They entered the garage, where a young man with an agreeable smile greeted them with a rather silly laugh.
"Ho, ho, ho!" "Hello, Badger," said Bobby. "You remember Frankie, don't you?"
Badger clearly didn't, but he said,
"Ho, ho, ho!"
again in a friendly way.
"Frankie wants to buy a car," said Bobby. "Well, come and look at what we've got in stock," said Badger.
"They look very smart," said Frankie, amazed by their extremely bright colours.
"That Chrysler is very good value," said Badger. "No," said Bobby. "Whatever she buys has got to go at least 40 miles an hour." Badger looked at his partner unhappily. "The standard isn't wonderful," said Bobby, "but I think it would just get you there."
"All right," said Frankie. "I'll have the standard."
Badger took Bobby to one side. "What do you think about the price?" he whispered. "I don't want to charge a friend of yours too much. £10?
£10 is all right," said Frankie. "I'll pay for it now."
"Who is she really?" asked Badger in a loud whisper. Bobby whispered back. "First time I ever knew anyone with a title who is prepared to pay cash," said Badger with respect. "They usually expect to put everything on an account."
Chapter 11. The Accident Happens. The place Frankie had selected for the accident was half a mile after the Staveley turn-off from the main road. "It couldn't be better," she said. "Straight down this hill, and then the road makes a sharp turn. If we let the car run down the hill, it will crash straight into the wall, and something terrible ought to happen to it."
"It should," Bobby agreed. "But someone ought to be watching at the corner."
"Quite right," said Frankie. "We don't want to involve anybody else. George can take his car down and turn it as though he were coming from the other direction. When he waves, it will show that all is clear."
"You're looking very pale, Frankie," said Bobby anxiously. "Are you all right?"
"I've got pale makeup on," explained Frankie. "Ready for the concussion."
"You'll look after yourself, won't you?" said Bobby with a sudden seriousness. "I mean, don't go and do anything foolish."
"I shall be extremely careful. I'll write a letter to my maid to bring to you when I want you to come down."
"I'll get busy with the moustache. See you later, Frankie."
They looked at each other for a moment, and then Frankie nodded and walked down the hill. George had turned the car. A handkerchief waved at the corner. Bobby leaned into the car and released the brake. The car moved forward, the engine started. Then the car went on down the hill and crashed into the wall. Bobby saw Frankie get into the wreckage. With a sigh, he got on his motorcycle and rode away in the direction of London. At the scene of the accident, things were busy. "Shall I roll about a bit?" asked Frankie, "to get myself dusty?"
"You might as well," said George. "No, lie still. I heard a bicycle bell."
Sure enough, at that moment, a boy of about 17 came whistling round the corner. He stopped at once, delighted with the sight that met his eyes.
"Oh," he said,
"has there been an accident?"
"No," said George sarcastically. "The young lady ran her car into the wall on purpose."
"Looks bad, doesn't it?" the boy said happily. "Is she dead?"
"Not yet," said George. "She must be taken somewhere at once. I'm a doctor. What's this place in here?"
"Merroway Court. It belongs to Mr. Bassington Ffrench."
"She must be carried there at once,"
said George authoritatively. Between them, they carried Frankie up the drive to a pleasant manor house. An elderly butler came out to meet them.
"There's been an accident," said George curtly. "Is there a room I can carry this lady into?"
A woman appeared. She was tall, with red hair, and was about 30 years of age. Her eyes were a light clear blue. "There is a spare bedroom on the ground floor," she said in a cool voice with a slight American accent. "Will you bring her in there? Ought I to telephone for a doctor?"
"I am a doctor," explained George. I was passing and saw the accident.
Oh, how fortunate. Come this way, will you? She showed them into a pleasant bedroom with windows onto the garden. Is she badly hurt? She inquired.
I can't tell yet.
Mrs. Bassington Ffrench took the hint and left the room. George studied his watch and finally said with relief,
Time.
George, darling, said Frankie, you've been an angel. George went in search of Mrs. Bassington Ffrench, whom he found in the drawing room.
Well, he said, she has very slight concussion, but she ought to stay quietly where she is for a day or so. He paused. She seems to be a Lady Frances Derwent.
Oh, said Mrs. Bassington Ffrench, I know some cousins of hers, the Draycotts, quite well.
I don't know if it's inconvenient for you to have her here, said George, but if she could stay.
Oh, of course, that will be all right, Dr.
Arbuthnot. By the way, I'll be passing a garage. I'll get them to see to her car.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arbuthnot. How very lucky you happen to be passing. I suppose a doctor ought to see her tomorrow, just to see she's getting on all right.
Oh, I don't think it's necessary, said George. All she needs is quiet. You can take my word for it.
If you really think so, Dr. Arbuthnot, said Mrs. Bassington Ffrench. Chapter 12. In the Enemy's Camp. Frankie spent a dull afternoon and evening lying in her room with the curtains closed. The next day, she opened them to let the daylight in, and her hostess came and sat with her. They discovered they knew many of the same people, and by the end of the day, Frankie felt a little guiltily that they had become friends. Mrs. Bassington Ffrench seemed a simple woman, very fond of her home, and yet Frankie felt that she was not quite happy. On the third day, Frankie left her room and was introduced to the master of the house. He was a big man, pleasant but a bit distant, and had rather strange eyes, Frankie thought. He seemed to spend a lot of his time working in his study. Tommy, their small boy, was 7 and a healthy, energetic child. Sylvia Bassington Ffrench obviously adored him. It's so nice down here, said Frankie with a sigh. She was lying out on a long chair in the garden. I don't know whether it's the bang on the head or what, but I'd like to lie here for days and days. Well, do, said Sylvia Bassington Ffrench. It's a great pleasure to me to have you here. You're so bright and amusing. It cheers me up. Frankie felt ashamed of herself. I feel we really have become friends, continued the other woman. Frankie felt still more ashamed. It was a mean thing she was doing. Mean. Her hostess went on. It won't be too boring here. Tomorrow, my brother-in-law is coming back. You'll like him, I'm sure. Everyone likes Roger. Does he live with you? Sometimes. He never sticks to a job for long. In fact, I don't believe he's ever done any real work in his life. But some people are just like that, especially in old families. And Roger is wonderfully sympathetic. I don't know what I would have done without him this spring when Tommy was ill. What was wrong with Tommy? He fell from the swing when the branch Roger had tied its ropes onto broke. Roger was very upset because he felt responsible, and we thought at first Tommy's back was badly hurt, but he's quite all right now. He certainly looks it, said Frankie, smiling as she heard him playing noisily in the distance. I know, it's such a relief. He's had bad luck in accidents. He was nearly drowned last winter. Was he really? Said Frankie thoughtfully. The feeling of guilt had gone. Accidents. Did Roger Bassington Ffrench specialize in accidents, she wondered? She said, "If you're sure, I'd love to stay a little longer. But won't your husband mind?" "Henry?" Mrs. Bassington Ffrench's face looked sad suddenly. "No, Henry won't mind. Henry never minds anything nowadays." Henry Bassington Ffrench joined them for tea, and Frankie studied him closely. There was certainly something strange about the man. His type was an obvious one, a sociable, sport-loving country gentleman. But such a man ought not to walk about nervously or sit in thoughts so deep that he seemed completely unaware of anyone else's presence, as now, or make bitter and sarcastic replies to anything said to him. Later, at dinner, he joked, laughed, told stories, and was quite brilliant. Too brilliant, Frankie felt. The brilliance was just as unnatural and out of character. "He has such strange eyes," Frankie thought. "They frighten me a little." Roger Bassington Ffrench arrived on the following afternoon, and they met on the grass where tea was laid. "This is my brother-in-law," Sylvia said, smiling. "Lady Frances Derwent." They shook hands. Frankie saw a tall, slim, very pleasant young man with deep blue eyes. He said, "I've been hearing all about the way you tried to break down the park wall." "I was driving an awful old car," said Frankie. "My own needed some repairs, and I bought a cheap one second-hand." Tommy arrived at this moment and threw himself upon his uncle with shouts of joy. Frankie watched them, feeling confused. Surely this charming young man couldn't be a cold-blooded murderer. But then who had pushed Pritchard over the cliff? And there was still the matter of the changed photograph, and who had put the morphia in Bobby's beer? With the thought of morphia, suddenly the explanation came to Frankie of Henry Bassington Ffrench's eyes with their tiny pupils. Was Henry Bassington Ffrench a drug addict? Chapter 13. Alan Carstairs. Strangely enough, Frankie's theory was confirmed the following day. She and Roger had been playing tennis and were sitting afterwards sipping iced drinks. Talking about various subjects, Frankie had become more and more aware of the charm of someone who had, like Roger, travelled all over the world. A pause was broken by Roger, and in an entirely different tone from the light-hearted one he'd been using.
"Lady Frances, I've known you less than 24 hours, but I feel that you're the one person I can ask advice from."
He paused again. He looked worried and upset.
"It's about my brother. His extreme changes of mood. He is taking drugs, I'm sure of it. Have you noticed his eyes? The pupils are very small."
"I have," admitted Frankie. "What do you think it is?"
"Morphia. I think it comes to him in the afternoon post. You'll have noticed how his mood changes between tea and dinner."
"Has it been going on for long?"
"About 6 months. The thing is, I don't know if I should tell Sylvia. That's why I thought you might be able to help me. Sylvia likes you a lot. What should I do, Lady Frances? If I tell her, I will worry her terribly."
"If she knew, she might have some influence," suggested Frankie.
"I doubt it. When it's drug-taking, nobody has any influence. No, I've been thinking that Henry might be prepared to go away for treatment if Sylvia didn't know, if her knowing was used as a threat."
"Would he have to go away?"
No, there's actually a place about 3 miles from here, run by a Dr. Nicholson, a Canadian, a very clever man, and, fortunately, Henry likes him. Hush, here comes Sylvia. Mrs. Bassington Ffrench joined them, saying, "Have you played much tennis?"
"We played one game," said Frankie.
"We must ask the Nicholsons over," said Sylvia. "She's very fond of tennis. Why, what is it?" She had seen the glance the other two had exchanged. "Nothing, only I happened to be talking about the Nicholsons to Lady Frances."
"They're Canadians, aren't they?" inquired Frankie.
"He is. I think that she is English. She's a very pretty little thing, quite charming, with the most lovely big, slightly sad eyes. I think she isn't very happy."
"He runs a kind of sanatorium, a nursing home, doesn't he?"
"Yes, nerve cases and people who take drugs. He's very successful, I believe. He's rather an impressive man."
"Do you like him?"
"No," said Sylvia, "I don't." Later on, she pointed out to Frankie a photograph which stood on the piano. "That's Moira Nicholson. A lovely face, isn't it? A man who came down here with friends of ours some time ago was quite attracted by it. He wanted an introduction, I think." She laughed. "I'll ask them to dinner tomorrow night. I'd like to know what you think of him. I dislike him, and yet he's quite attractive looking." Something in her tone made Frankie look at her quickly, but Sylvia had turned away. "It's time I asked some questions," Frankie thought, making up her mind. She began fairly naturally at dinner.
"You know," she said to Roger, "I can't help feeling that we've met before. It wasn't by any chance at that party of Lady Shane's at Claridge's on the 16th?
"It couldn't have been on the 16th, said Sylvia quickly. "Roger was here. We had a children's party that day, and what I would have done without Roger, I simply don't know." She gave a grateful glance at her brother-in-law, and he smiled back at her. "I'm sure if I had met you before, I'd remember it," Roger said. One point settled, thought Frankie. Roger Bassington Ffrench was not in Wales on the day Bobby was poisoned.
"Strangely enough, that was the day a man fell over the cliff in our neighbourhood. I went home a few days later, and I went to the inquest, thinking it would be exciting."
"Was that at Marchbolt?" asked Sylvia. Frankie nodded.
"Derwent Castle is only about 7 miles from Marchbolt," she explained.
"Roger, that must have been your man," cried Sylvia. Frankie looked inquiringly at him. "I was actually there," said Roger. "I stayed with the body till the police came."
"How perfectly extraordinary," said Frankie.
There was a general atmosphere of how strange, isn't the world small? Frankie felt she was doing this rather well. "Roger had some silly idea of buying a house down there," said Sylvia.
"Complete rubbish," said Henry Bassington Ffrench. "You know perfectly well, Roger, that as soon as you'd bought it, you'd get bored staying in one place and go off abroad again."
Roger laughed. Then he turned to Frankie. "Was there anything interesting or exciting at the inquest?"
"Oh, no, it was all boringly straightforward, and some unpleasant relations came and identified the man. He was on a walking tour, it seems. It was very sad, really, because he was extremely good-looking. Did you see his picture in the papers?"
"I did," said Sylvia. "He looked very like that man, Alan Carstairs. I remember saying so at the time." "Yes," agreed Roger. "He did look like him, in that photograph." "You can't tell from newspaper pictures, can you?" said Sylvia. Everyone, it seemed to Frankie, had reacted with perfect naturalness.
The only thing she had succeeded in was getting a name. Alan Carstairs. Chapter 14. Dr. Nicholson. Frankie said to Sylvia the following morning,
"That man you mentioned last night, Alan Carstairs, I feel sure I've heard that name before."
"I expect you have. He's rather a celebrity. He's a Canadian, an explorer. Some friends of ours, the Rivingtons, brought him down one day for lunch. A very attractive man, big and suntanned, and with nice blue eyes. Last year, he went on a tour through Africa with that millionaire, John Savage, the one who thought he had cancer and killed himself in that sad way." Frankie was convinced that Alan Carstairs had been the victim at Marchbolt, but to show too much interest would be fatal. Inquiries must be discreet.
"I don't want to be poisoned,"
thought Frankie with a frown. That evening, Dr. Nicholson and his wife were expected to dinner. Carstairs had been a Canadian. Dr. Nicholson was a Canadian. Madness to build anything upon that, of course, but wasn't it just too much of a coincidence? Dr. Nicholson was a big man with a manner that suggested great power. His speech was slow, and he said very little that evening, but somehow he made every word sound important. He wore strong glasses, and behind them his pale blue eyes seemed very large. His wife was a slim and delicate creature of perhaps 27, pretty, indeed beautiful. She seemed, Frankie thought, nervous and chattered too quickly.
"You had an accident, I hear, Lady Frances,"
said Dr. Nicholson as he took his seat beside her at the dinner table. Frankie explained what had happened. She wondered why she should feel so nervous doing so. There was no reason for him to suspect that she had staged the accident.
"That was too bad,"
he said as she finished.
"But you seem to have made a very good recovery."
"We won't admit she's cured yet. We're keeping her with us," said Sylvia. The doctor's gaze went to Sylvia.
"I should keep her with you as long as possible,"
he said very seriously. Frankie was sitting between her host and Dr. Nicholson. Henry Bassington Ffrench was very moody tonight. His hands shook, he ate almost nothing, and took no part in the conversation. Mrs. Nicholson had a difficult time with him, and turned to Roger with obvious relief. But Frankie noticed that her eyes went to her husband's face frequently. Dr. Nicholson turned to Frankie again.
"I had heard of your accident, you know. One thing about it bothered me."
"Yes?" said Frankie, her heart beating fast suddenly.
"The doctor who was passing, the one who brought you in here.
"Yes?"
He must have had a strange character, to turn his car before going to the rescue."
"I don't understand."
"Of course not. You were unconscious. But young Reeves, the message boy who accompanied you here, came from Staveley on his bicycle, and no car passed him, yet he came round the corner, found the crash, and the doctor's car pointing the same way he was going, towards London. You see the point? The doctor did not come from Staveley, so he must have come the other way down the hill. Therefore, he must have turned his car."
The pale blue eyes were staring at her through the thick glasses.
"You sound like a detective, Jasper," said Mrs. Nicholson, "and all about nothing at all."
"Little things interest me,"
said Nicholson. He turned to his hostess, and Frankie took a breath of relief. It seemed to her that Dr. Nicholson was an evil man. She kept out of his way after dinner, staying close to the gentle, delicate Mrs. Nicholson. She noticed that all the time Mrs. Nicholson's eyes still watched her husband. Was it love, Frankie wondered, or fear? Nicholson devoted himself to Sylvia, and at 10:30 he must have made a secret sign to his wife, for they got up to leave at the same moment.
"Well," said Roger after they had gone, "what do you think of our Dr. Nicholson? He has a very strong personality, hasn't he?"
"I'm like Sylvia," said Frankie. "I don't like him very much. I like her better."
"Good looking, but rather a little idiot," said Roger. "She either adores him or is scared to death of him. I don't know which."
"That's just what I wondered," agreed Frankie.
"I don't like him," said Sylvia, "but I must admit he's got a lot of power. I believe he's cured drug takers in the most marvelous way. People whose relations had become really desperate, they've gone there as a last hope and come out absolutely cured."
Yes, cried Henry Bassington Ffrench suddenly. "And do you know what goes on there? Do you know the pain he suffers? A man gets used to a drug, but they take it away from him suddenly, and he goes mad because he doesn't have it and beats his head against the wall. That's what he does, your powerful doctor, tortures people."
He was shaking violently. Suddenly, he turned and left the room. Sylvia looked shocked.
"What is the matter with Henry?" she asked.
Frankie and Roger dared not look at each other. Before she went to sleep that night, Frankie wrote to Bobby.